London, 1850. The city was drowned in fog, thick and viscous, like old wine. This fog seeped through the cracks in the windows, stuck in the lungs of passers-by, muffled sounds and hid secrets in its grey embrace. Henry Grayson sat at his desk in a cramped office in Fleet Street. Clerks' pens creaked around him, the clock on the wall ticked monotonously, counting down the seconds of a life that seemed as grey as the walls of his office. Henry was a thin man with a pale face and deep-set eyes the color of stagnant water. His hands, covered with ink stains, mechanically entered the numbers in the ledger. Every day Henry started the same. He woke up at 6 in the morning in his cold attic room, washed himself quickly with ice water from a jug, put on the only decent suit and hurried to work, stopping only to buy a cup of hot tea from a street vendor. This morning, however, something was different. The air seemed electrified, as if before a thunderstorm. Henry could feel it with every cell in his body, but he couldn't understand exactly what had changed. The answer came after dinner, when a young courier brought a letter. The envelope was heavy, with a dark red wax seal bearing a strange symbol, a cross between a tree and a human hand. "Mr. Grayson?" the courier asked, and Henry nodded, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. With trembling fingers, Henry tore open the envelope. The smell of old paper and ink filled his nostrils. Words on paper danced before his eyes: heritage, distant relative, ancient house. Henry read the letter 3 times before the content began to sink into his mind. A certain Edward Blackwood, whose existence Henry did not even suspect, bequeathed him an ancient estate. The house was located in the county of Sussex, in a small village called Ravenwood. Ravenwood, Henry whispered, the word ringing through the silence of the office like a bell. The other clerks raised their heads from their papers, looking at Henry with surprise and slight envy. For the rest of the day, Henry couldn't concentrate on his work. His thoughts kept returning to the letter that lay in the inside pocket of his jacket like a piece of toast. He envisioned a huge Gothic mansion surrounded by dark woods, full of secrets and possibly treasures. When the workday was finally over, Henry hurried home. He went up the stairs to his attic, lit an old kerosene lamp, and took out the letter again. In the flickering light of the lamp, he studied each word, each letter, as if trying to find a hidden message. Henry couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thoughts of the mysterious house running through his mind. What is there? Who is this unknown relative? Why did he, Henry Grayson, receive this inheritance? The shadows on the walls seemed alive, they whispered, called to him. The wind outside the window howled like the voices of ghosts. It seemed to Henry that London itself had changed, become alien and threatening. Finally, unable to bear it, Henry got up from the bed and went to the window. The city below was shrouded in fog, through which the light of the gas lamps barely broke through. And suddenly Henry saw it, a dark figure standing in the middle of the street and looking straight at his window. Henry's heart froze, and then beat at a frantic speed. He closed his eyes, hoping it was just a play of his imagination, and when he opened them again, the figure was gone. Henry went back to bed, but he couldn't sleep. He knew that his life would never be the same. Something was waiting for him in Ravenwood, something ancient and powerful. And although Henry was scared, he felt that he could not refuse this opportunity. With the first rays of the sun, Henry made a decision. He will take a leave of absence and go to Ravenwood. He must learn the truth, whatever it may be. The next morning, Henry came to the office earlier than usual. His boss, Mr. Fitzgerald, a fat man with a red face, raised his eyebrows in surprise when he saw Henry outside his office. "Grayson? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Henry licked his lips nervously. "Mr. Fitzgerald, I have to take a leave of absence. Family circumstances." Fitzgerald looked at him intently. "Family background? You don't have a family, Grayson." It turns out there is, Henry replied quietly, feeling sweat running down his back. After a long pause, Fitzgerald nodded. A week. No more. And don't forget to finish the report before you leave. Henry breathed a sigh of relief. He had spent the entire day feverishly working on the report, his mind already wandering the dark corridors of an unknown estate. The next morning, Henry stood on the platform of Victoria Station. The fog still hung over the city, but now it seemed to Henry a curtain between two worlds, the familiar London and the unknown future that awaited him. The train started moving, and Henry felt something inside him snap. The wheels rattled on the rails as if counting the beats of his heart. Gloomy landscapes floated by the window, black trees, empty fields, deserted villages. It seemed to Henry that he was going to the end of the world. There was only one passenger in the compartment with him, an elderly woman with sharp facial features and piercing eyes. She did not take her eyes off Henry, and this caused him inexplicable anxiety. "Are you going to Ravenwood?" she suddenly asked, and Henry shuddered in surprise. "Yes." "How do you know?" The woman smiled, but her smile did not touch her eyes. "Oh, I know a lot, young man. Ravenwood is a strange place. It changes people." Henry felt goosebumps run up his spine. "What do you mean?" "Be careful what you look for," the woman whispered. "Sometimes it's better to leave the past in the past." Before Henry could ask anything else, the train came to a screeching halt at the small station. The woman got up and, without saying another word, left the compartment. Henry spent the rest of the trip alone, trying to figure out the meaning of the mysterious passenger's words. When the train finally arrived at the station near Ravenwood, it was getting dark. The station greeted him with dead silence. Not a soul around, just an old wooden shed that looked like it was about to collapse. Henry looked around, hoping to see at least some transport, but to no avail. Suddenly he heard the sound of hooves. An old horse-drawn carriage emerged from the fog. The coachman, an old man with a long gray beard, looked at Henry with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "You to Blackwood Manor?" he asked in a hoarse voice. Henry nodded, feeling his heart start to beat faster again. "Sit down," said the coachman, and Henry heard a note of sympathy in his voice. The wagon moved, plunging into the dense forest. Tree branches hung over the road, creating a tunnel that seemed to lead to another world. Henry tried to speak to the driver, but he only mumbled something incoherent in response. Finally, the forest parted, and Henry saw it, a huge Gothic mansion towering over the hill. Its dark windows stared at Henry like the eyes of an ancient monster. The driver stopped the wagon at the foot of the hill. "I won't go any further," he said, avoiding Henry's gaze. "This place, it's cursed. People say no one lives there for more than a few months. Be careful." Henry got off the wagon, feeling the ground pulsate under his feet. He turned to thank the driver, but he had already turned the cart around and was speeding away, disappearing into the fog. Left alone, Henry slowly walked towards the house. Each step was given to him with difficulty, as if some invisible force was trying to hold him back. The house turned out to be much older than he imagined. High, gloomy walls, overgrown with ivy, and closed shutters created the feeling that time really stood still here. The heavy wooden door was decorated with the same symbol as the seal on the letter, a tree hand. Henry took a deep breath and pulled the doorbell. The sound spread through the house, bouncing off the walls and returning as a muffled echo. Silence. Then, suddenly, the door creaked open. An elderly woman in black was standing at the door. Her face was pale and wrinkled, and her eyes. Henry shuddered. Her eyes were the same as the woman on the train. "Welcome home, Mr. Grayson," she said with a small smile. "We have been waiting for you for so long." And at that moment, Henry realized that he had crossed the line beyond which there was no turning back. His new life began here and now, in this gloomy house, full of secrets and, maybe, horrors. Henry crossed the threshold, and the door closed behind him with a dull thud, as if cutting him off from the outside world. It was semi-dark inside, the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. The woman who met him introduced herself as Mrs. Grimming, the housekeeper of the estate. "Your room is ready, Mr. Grayson," she said as she led him up the wide stairs. "Mr. Blackwood has left some instructions for you. You will find them in your room." Henry's room was spacious, with a huge four-poster bed and antique furniture. An envelope lay on the desk. Henry took it with trembling hands and opened it. "Dear Henry," he began to read. "If you are reading this, then I have already left this world. You may not know me, but I know everything about you. You are the last of our family, and now it is up to you to continue our work. In the library you will find everything is necessary. Be careful and remember, not everything you see and hear will be real. Edward Blackwood." Henry reread the letter several times, trying to understand its meaning. What's the matter? What did he mean by not everything will be real? Henry hardly slept that night. He was lying in a huge bed, listening to the sounds of the house. It seemed to him that the walls were whispering, that shadows were moving in dark corners. Once or twice he even heard footsteps outside the door of his room, but when he looked down the hall, there was no one there. At dawn, tired but too excited to sleep, Henry decided to explore the house. He started with the library mentioned in the letter. The library turned out to be a huge room lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling. There were thousands of volumes here, old leather-bound tomes, scrolls of parchment, even a few books that looked like they were written on human skin. Henry spent several hours looking through the books. Most of them were in unfamiliar languages, with strange symbols and diagrams. But one book caught his attention, an old diary lying on the table in the center of the room. When Henry opened it, he realized that he had found something extraordinary. The diary dates back to the 12th century. The records of his ancestors spoke of an ancient mystery that they had been trying to solve for centuries. May 5, 1215. Today I came closer to the solution. The word has 7 letters, each corresponding to one of the deadly sins. But the price of knowledge proved too high. I hear their footsteps outside the door, their whispers in the dark. God, help me. October 17, 1452. I found the 3rd letter. It burns in my dreams, burns my soul. But I cannot stop. The word calls me. June 3, 1666. 5 letters. I am so near. London is burning, and I know it is my fault. Words have power, and that power is destructive. Henry flipped through the pages, feeling a cold sweat run down his back. Each entry was filled with the fear and desperation with which his ancestors tried to form the word. But why? What power did it have? Suddenly he heard a noise behind him. Turning, Henry saw Mrs. Grimming standing in the doorway of the library. "Dinner is ready, Mr. Grayson," she said, but her eyes were fixed on the diary in Henry's hands. "I see you have already started your research. What does it all mean?" Henry asked. "What kind of word? Why is it so important?" Mrs. Grimming shook her head. "None of my business, sir. But be careful. Knowledge is not always a blessing. Sometimes it can be a curse." With that she left, leaving Henry alone with his thoughts and the mysterious diary. He knew he couldn't stop until he solved the riddle. But is he ready to pay the same price as in his ancestors? The next few days became one long nightmare for Henry. He hardly slept, spending hours studying his diary and other books in the library. His food was brought to him by Mrs. Grimming, but Henry scarcely touched it, completely engrossed in his research. Gradually he began to form a word. Each letter he deciphered seemed to change the reality around him. The walls of the house seemed to breathe, the shadows became longer and deeper. Sometimes Henry heard whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and sometimes he saw movement out of the corner of his eye where no one should be. On the 5th day, Henry found the 5th letter. That night he was tormented by nightmares. He saw dark figures circling around him, whispering in an unfamiliar language. Waking up in a cold sweat, Henry saw that an inscription appeared on the mirror in his room, made as if by blood, "Stop before it's too late." But Henry could not stop. He felt that he was close to the solution, and this obsession consumed him completely. On the 7th day, when the sun was already setting behind the horizon, painting the sky in blood-red colors, Henry found the last, 7th letter. His hands were shaking as he wrote down the word in its entirety. "Inferno," he whispered, and at the same moment the house shuddered as if from an earthquake. The candles in the room went out and then flared up again, but now their flames were black. Henry felt the air around him thicken, become heavy and hot. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, dark silhouettes with burning eyes. They surrounded him, whispering in a language he was suddenly beginning to understand. Finally, they said, "The heir has fulfilled his duty. The gate is open." Henry realized what he had done. The word was the key that opened the passage between the worlds. And now the dark forces that his ancestors had held back for centuries were free. But something inside Henry changed. He felt a power flowing through him, a power that belonged to his lineage. And he realized that now he had a choice. "No," he said firmly, looking directly into the burning eyes of the dark creatures. "I will not allow you to enter this world." Henry closed his eyes and concentrated on the word, but now he was saying it backwards. "Amrefni," he shouted, and the room was filled with light. The dark figures screamed and began to dissolve. The house shook again, but this time Henry felt that it was not a destruction, but a cleansing. When it was over, Henry opened his eyes. The room was the same as before, but the air seemed cleaner, brighter. He went to the window and saw that the fog that surrounded the house had dissipated, revealing a beautiful garden. Mrs. Grimming appeared in the doorway, her face full of wonder and respect. "You did it, Mr. Grayson," she said. "You broke the curse." Henry nodded, feeling both exhausted and relieved. "Yes," he answered. But the price was high. He knew that now his life had changed forever. He was the keeper of the secret, the last of the Blackwood family, and it was his responsibility to ensure that dark forces never again threatened this world. The next morning, Henry took a train to London. When he was standing on the platform, deep in thought, he suddenly saw how the thief snatched the woman's bag and ran away. Henry felt something inside him change. Without thinking, he focused on the fugitive, and at the same moment the thief seemed to come across an invisible wall, stopped and fell to the ground. Passers-by stopped, watching the incredible scene. Henry, himself surprised by his abilities, realized that he now possessed a special gift that came to him with his inheritance. Returning to London, Henry knew that his life would never be the same. He had power, but now he understood that with this power came great responsibility. And he was ready to accept this responsibility, knowing that this is his destiny to protect the world from the darkness that is always waiting for an opportunity return. Returning to London, Henry found that the city had changed. Either he himself looked at everything with different eyes, or something really happened to the reality around him. The shadows seemed deeper, the colors brighter, and the people on the streets more transparent, as if he could see into their souls. Henry returned to his work in the office, but now it seemed to him a pointless occupation. He knew that his true purpose was something much greater. One evening, on his way home, Henry heard a scream from a dark alley. Without hesitation, he rushed there and saw 3 men attacking a young woman. Henry felt the power within him awaken. He raised his hand and the attackers suddenly froze like statues. "Go," he said to the woman, who, trembling, ran out of the alley. Henry then turned to the attackers. And you, he said, looking straight into their eyes, you will remember this night as a terrible dream. And you will never harm the innocent again. He snapped his fingers and the men came to, looking around in confusion. From that day on, Henry began to use his new abilities to help people. At night he roamed the streets of London, protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty. People began to whisper about a mysterious protector who appeared out of nowhere and disappeared into the shadows. But the more Henry used his power, the more he felt something inside him change. Sometimes he would catch his reflection in the windows and see his eyes flash for a moment with a dark fire. He began to hear whispers of dark creatures calling to him, promising even greater power. One day, Henry met an old woman on the street whom he had seen on the train during his first trip to Blackwood Manor. "You are at a crossroads, young man," she said, looking at him with a penetrating look. "The power you have been given is a gift and a curse at the same time. It can save the world or destroy it. And only you can decide which path to take." Henry realized she was right. He could feel the darkness within him growing, threatening to consume him completely. But he also felt the light that fought this darkness. He decided to return to Blackwood Manor to find answers to his questions and learn how to control his power. When Henry arrived at the estate, he found that the house had changed. The dark shadows were gone, and now he looked bright and friendly. Mrs. Grimming greeted him with a smile. "I knew you'd come back," she said. "Your training is just beginning." Over the next months, Henry studied ancient books in the library, learning to control his power and understand the nature of darkness and light. He learned that his family had stood guard between the two worlds for centuries, maintaining the balance. One day, as Henry was meditating in the garden, he felt something change in the air. He opened his eyes and saw the ghost of Edward Blackwood before him. "You did well, Henry," said the ghost. "But your real test is yet to come. The darkness is gathering strength again, and soon it will try to break into our world. You must be ready." Henry nodded, feeling his resolve strengthen. He knew he had an uphill battle ahead of him, but now he was ready for it. He was no longer a simple clerk from London. He was Henry Grayson, the last of the Blackwoods, protector of the light and keeper of the balance between the worlds. And when darkness comes, he will be ready to meet her. The months at Blackwood Manor flew by like a single day. Henry could feel his strength growing, but his anxiety was growing along with it. He knew that the darkness was not slumbering, and the time of the great test was approaching. One autumn evening, when the leaves in the garden had already begun to turn yellow, Henry felt a strange tremor in the air. He left the house and saw black clouds gathering over London, far on the horizon. But these were not ordinary clouds, they moved against the wind and seemed alive. "The time has come," Henry whispered, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. He quickly packed up and left for London. The train seemed too slow, and Henry used his power for the first time to move directly to the center of the city. London greeted him with chaos. People ran through the streets in panic, the sky darkened in the middle of the day, and strange shadows crawled out of the dark alleys and grabbed passers-by. Henry realized that the boundary between the worlds was beginning to crumble. The dark creatures he had seen at Blackwood Manor were now freely infiltrating our world. He began to act. Using his powers, Henry created barriers of light that protected people from dark creatures. He moved from place to place, rescuing those who were in danger. But the more he used his power, the more he felt the darkness within him grow. The voices in his head grew louder, promising even greater power if he surrendered. In the midst of the battle, Henry met his old boss, Mr. Fitzgerald. He stood in the middle of the street, paralyzed by fear of a dark creature approaching him. Henry rushed to help without hesitation. He created a shield of light around Fitzgerald and pushed the dark creature back into the shadows. "Grayson?" Fitzgerald muttered in surprise. "What's going on? How did you do that?" Henry just smiled. "Long story, sir. The most important thing now is to find a safe place. Follow me. He led Fitzgerald and a group of others to the old church. Using his knowledge gained at Blackwood Manor, Henry created a protective barrier around the building. But he knew that this was only a temporary solution. To stop the invasion, it was necessary to close the rift between the worlds. Henry concentrated and felt where the source of the darkness was. It was in the very heart of London, on Trafalgar Square. When he got there, he saw a terrible picture. A huge vortex of darkness rose to the sky, and in its center stood a figure in a black cloak. Henry recognized this figure. It was the same demon he had seen in his nightmares at Blackwood Manor. "At last you have come, heir to the Blackwoods," the demon thundered in a voice that shook the earth. "You're the last thing standing between us and this world. Join us and we'll give you power you can't even dream of." Henry felt the darkness within him respond to these words. A part of him wanted to accept this offer, to feel absolute power. But then he remembered the people he had saved, Mrs. Grimming, his father, and all his ancestors who had fought this darkness for centuries. "No," Henry said firmly. "I will never join you. I am Henry Grayson, the last of the Blackwoods, and I am here to stop you." With these words, he gathered all his strength and directed it against the demon. Light and darkness clashed in an epic battle that seemed to last forever. Henry could feel his strength draining away, but he did not give up. He remembered the words from an old diary, "Words have power." And then he understood what needed to be done. Summoning the last of his strength, Henry shouted the word that had once opened the gate between the worlds, but now he uttered it with a different intention: to close the gate forever. "Inferno!" he shouted, putting all his will and power of his kind into this word. A bright light flashed around him, and Henry felt the darkness recede. The demon screamed in pain and began to dissolve into the air. The vortex of darkness began to shrink, pulling back into the rift between the worlds. And finally, with one last flash of light, the rift closed. Henry fell to his knees, exhausted but victorious. The sky over London began to clear, and the first rays of the sun broke through the clouds. People began to come out of their hiding places, looking at Henry with surprise and gratitude. He knew that the world would never be the same, but now he had a new goal: to protect this world and teach others to fight the darkness. Henry stood up, ready to face his new fate. He was no longer a simple clerk. He became the protector of London, the keeper of the balance between light and darkness. And although he knew that there were still many challenges ahead, Henry was ready for them. Because now he understood true strength is not in magic or supernatural abilities, but in the courage to face the darkness and choose the light, even when at the hardest. Years have passed since that fateful battle in Trafalgar Square. London has changed, but not everyone has noticed these changes. For most of the residents, life returned to normal, and the events of that day became only a vague memory that they preferred to forget. But Henry Grayson never forgot. He continued his mission, protecting the city from dark forces that tried to infiltrate our world from time to time. By day he still worked as a clerk, but now in Scotland Yard's Special Unusual Cases Department. The Blackwood estate became his refuge and school. There he trained a small group of people who, like him, had the ability to see what was hidden from others. Mrs. Grimming, who turned out to be much older and wiser than it seemed at first, became his mentor and friend. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, sitting in his office at the estate, Henry would take out an old diary and reread the records of his ancestors. He now understood their fears and doubts, but also their courage and devotion to duty. Light and darkness will always be part of our world, Henry thought. Our task is not to destroy the darkness completely, but to maintain the balance and protect those who cannot protect themselves. And although he sometimes felt the burden of his responsibility, Henry knew that he had chosen the right path. Because in the end, the greatest magic is not supernatural powers, but the ability of the human heart to resist the darkness and choose the light, again and again, every day. And so Henry Grayson, the last of the Blackwoods, continued his watch, guarding the border between worlds and reminding us all that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope if we have the courage to look for it.